Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm Bob Clay and welcome to Alaska Weather. Let's get right into the show here. We have some warnings and advisories for you. We'll start over towards the central Arctic coast there and have wind chill advisories, 50 to 55 below zero, and that's in effect until Tuesday afternoon. We have winter storm warning for blowing snow and low wind chills to 60 below, and also on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast there's a blizzard warning, and then for the northeastern portions of the Brooks Range there's a winter storm warning for low wind chills and blowing snow. And all these warnings are in effect until about noon Tuesday. And then last but not least, we have a wind chill advisory for the southeastern portions of the Brooks Range there. And those are wind chills 50 to 55 below, and those are in effect until about noon Tuesday. And then the other ones we have wind chill advisories to 50 below over the western portion of the Seward Peninsula and down over the Kuskokwim Delta, wind chill advisories to wind chills to 50 below zero. Okay, let's take a look at our weather map. Actually, we're not going to take a look at our weather map. We're going to do the satellite first. Okay, basically, we'll just kind of set this in motion here. And there are some clouds over the interior, but over the western interior, clear skies. But they're showing up as white there because of very cold temperatures over the interior sections. You can see a frontal system kind of extending across Haida there, produced a little light rain. And we did have some rain showers along the, rain and snow showers along the North Gulf Coast there, and also some rain showers reported over towards Sitka this afternoon. Further off to the west here, there's an old frontal system here. Why not just kind of move over a little bit? You can see it. There's an old frontal system here extending just south of the Aleutians here, and then there's what's left of one, which is extending right across the Pribilofs here. We'll kind of set this in motion again. Let you take a look at it here. And a little light snow reported over towards the Pribs today, and some rain and snow. Actually, snow for the most part on the northern end of the Alaska Peninsula and over towards Unalaska. And we did have a mixture of rain and snow out over towards the Aleutian Islands. And then we'll take a look now at the visible satellite imagery. And it's not great this time of year because, it's still fairly dark and fairly low sun angle. But you can see it. We do have a few breaks and clouds over the north of Gulf Coast. And then there's quite a few breaks over south central Alaska. And we'll kind of set this in motion one more time. Then we'll get into the weather maps here. And you can see there we go. Some breaks over towards Kodiak, and you can see there's quite a bit of cloud cover out over in the Bering Sea. All right, now for today's weather map. We'll start off over to the west here. You can see there's an old frontal system which is further out to the west, near the western Aleutians. Again, a little rain and snow with that. And then this is the one that's going to be a little bit more impactful over the next day or so as it kind of progresses off to the north and east. But again, we had just had some light snow and some windy conditions along the central Aleutian Islands, and actually also over into the Alaska Peninsula, mainly the western portion. Clear skies for the most part over southwest Alaska and over western Alaska. Along the Arctic coast there, they had a trough kind of slipping south on them there, and produced some pretty gusty winds with some blowing snow up along the central and eastern portions of the Arctic slope, again with those low wind chills. And then over into the Yukon Territory, we have a low pressure center which has kind of moved into that area, and still some snow up in that area. And then over in southeast Alaska, I can't really see it that well, but on the radar we did have some showers over along the coastal areas there. and then the frontal system over towards Haida produced a little light rain in those areas. Okay, now for tonight's weather map, we're going to see this frontal system. It's really not going to go a whole lot, very far, so we'll just see basically some light rain or some fog over towards the Haida. As we get over in towards southeast Alaska, that onshore flow will continue to see some rain and snow showers in those areas through tonight. Probably just north of Ketchikan, there'll be rain and snow showers, and then Ketchikan south, just what did I say? I said rain and snow showers from north of Ketchikan, and then in just Ketchikan south would probably just be just rain showers. Okay, now along the North Gulf Coast, we've got a kind of a trough extending from that low over the Yukon Territory. And what that's going to do is, with the high pressure kind of building over the mainland, we're going to see those gradients continuing pretty strong. So we're going to see some pretty decent outflow winds, particularly over on the eastern portion of the Kenai Peninsula. And we'll also see some outflow conditions probably along the North Gulf Coast also. Along the Arctic coast, generally we're going to be looking for some snow, with some blowing snow continuing with those blizzard warnings and winter storm warnings up in those areas through tonight and into Tuesday. And over the mainland areas, generally we'll see some fair skies with some patchy fog as high pressure takes hold. And over the Alaska Peninsula, look for basically rain and snow on the north side, rain on the south side, and probably a mixture of rain and snow as it warms up just a little bit as this frontal system kicks north. And again, rain and snow showers along the central and eastern Aleutians, actually all the way out to the western Aleutians. And this frontal system out here, the furthest west one, it will be weakening over the next day or so. And Monday, well, there it is. You don't see it anymore. And we see this, the one here is kind of starting to elongate off to the northeast over towards Bristol Bay. So it'll probably bring some snow into Kodiak by afternoon hours on Monday. Snow and some blowing snow up along the Bristol Bay coastal areas there, blowing snow over towards St. Paul. And then south of that, it starts to mix up with rain. And then just south of the front, we'll see rain and rain showers along the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. And then a strong northwesterly flow, a little cooler on the western side of that front there. So we'll see a mixture of rain and snow in those areas. Mainland areas will still be fair skies for the most part, with some patchy fog. And then along the Arctic coast, some blowing snow up in those areas. Again, some low wind chills. In the southeast Alaska, now we see a frontal system kind of rolling up in this broad baroclinic zone here. And so we'll see some rain probably started spreading to the southern end of the Panhandle. But for the most part, most of the Panhandle will be seeing some decreasing clouds by the afternoon hours on Monday. Now, on Tuesday's forecast, we're going to see that low kind of moves over into Canada there. We're going to see quite a few breaks with the ridging kind of building over in southeast Alaska. Maybe a little patchy fog in the morning, but I think for the most part, they should see a relatively sunny day as we get in towards Tuesday. And we see this next frontal system starting to roll up and well south of the Gulf yet. However, it's going to start to bring some winds up into the offshore waters, probably near gale force or so as we get into Tuesday night time frame. And we'll see, and I didn't indicate it here, but with that easterly flow, we'll probably see maybe a snow shower or two over towards Kodiak Island. Mainland should still see some pretty nice conditions. And, you know, I've got it late in the day on Tuesday. I think the winds probably will subside a little bit, but again, those blizzard warnings and winter storm warnings will continue at least into the noon hours on Tuesday. And I think we will see a gradual diminishing of winds after that. Okay, and we'll see. We've got this frontal system here, which was kind of moving up into Bristol Bay. Now it's kind of falling apart here. However, we'll have some clouds moving over into the Delta area there. Maybe a little snow along the coastal areas. And then, but the big story with this one is we're going to have some pretty strong northerly winds on the backside of cold advection. So over the central and western Aleutian Islands, look for some blowing snow and strong winds and snow showers in those areas. All right, now this is the temperatures for the day, and we'll start over towards southeast Alaska, generally 40s for the most part, 30s along the coastal areas. You can see rapidly drops off in the single digits to minus numbers as you get into the interior sections. Minus teens over the central interiors. Actually, I forgot to mention here, but down in Ketchikan here, we had a high of 48, and Bettles had a low of minus 50 overnight. But as of 3 p.m., you can see they're up to about 44 below, if you could say that's up to much. And then as we move a little bit further north here, okay, there we go. Okay, oh, there we go. We're moving north now, generally minus 20s up along the Arctic coast there, minus teens. Some minus teens over the coastal south or western Alaska, minus 20s to 30s over in southwest Alaska. And along the Alaska Peninsula, generally 20s, 30s along the Aleutian Islands, and the 20s in the Pribilof Islands. Okay, for our lows for tonight, generally you're going to look for the 30s for the most part along the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, except maybe a few 20s as you get over the over towards Port Hayden, and then you can see where the cooler temperatures start with the minus numbers as you get along in the southwest Alaska there. Pretty cold over the interior sections, minus 40s for the most part, minus 46 expected up over in the Yukon Valley there. And then as we get up along the Arctic coast, there's some minus 20s to minus 30s. And kind of the warm spots are going to be in the 30s for the most part over in southeast Alaska. Okay, now for tomorrow's temperatures, 30s to 40s over in southeast Alaska, 20s to, along the North Gulf Coast. You can see cooler temperatures, minus 20s to minus 30s over the central and interior sections, and along the Arctic coast, Beaufort Sea coast. Look for some minus teens over southwest Alaska. Warmer along the coast as that the clouds and some moisture move up with that weakening frontal system. So we'll probably get in the single digits to teens, 30s along to 40s along the Alaska Peninsula, 30s and 40s along the Aleutians, and we'll see the 20s kind of holding in to the Pribilof Islands throughout today, tomorrow. Okay, for our flying weather, generally, as you would expect, with our frontal system moving up there and a weakening one over the Pribilofs, we're going to see generally widespread IFR along the Alaska Peninsula and the southern portion of the Bering Sea, along with the Aleutians. Now, over in mainland Alaska, I think we're going to be, for the most part, as we stay south of the Brooks Range there, we should see pretty much VFR conditions, but we will see some spotty IFR and ice fog around. IFR conditions along the Arctic coast with the blowing snow in those areas. And then as we get over to southeast Alaska, I think for the most part we're going to see probably becoming VFR, but there'll probably be a little bit of marginal VFR over the central sections. And I probably should have indicated here, but we'll also see some marginal VFR as that frontal system kind of sweeps up, just so it maybe eclipse the southeast portion with a little rain for tomorrow. And as we get into our past conditions around the state, we'll look at Anaktuvuk. We'll be looking at VFR conditions still along the Brooks Range, again VFR. Now along the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, we'll see some VFR conditions as well as rainy, windy VFR, Isabel VFR, Mantesta VFR, Tanita VFR, Portage. And while we're talking about those ones along the Alaska Range and along the North Gulf Coast there, particularly Portage, look for some turbulent conditions there. We'll have pretty strong pressure gradients along those areas, so we'll see some pretty gusty gap winds through those areas. And now moving on in the southeast Alaska, Chilkoot and White Pass, look for VFR conditions there. And again, with the high pressure building over the interior, we should start to see some gusty winds moving through those gaps at least by the afternoon hours and into Tuesday. All right, now for tomorrow's freezing levels. Well, as you can guess, most of it's going to be below over off the mainland there. So as that only places we're going to see above freezing or near freezing will be along the Aleutians and probably the western portion of the Alaska Peninsula, and then as we get over along in southeast Alaska. All right, now for icing conditions, the main area of icing pretty much is going to be along this frontal system here up to about 12,000 feet, moderate rain and mixed icing. And then now I'm looking at our jet stream. Okay, we're going to have a southwest jet about 70 knots going across the eastern Gulf there, well south of along the North Pacific there. We're going to have about 130 knot westerly jet, and coming across the Kamchatka Peninsula, look for about, move my head there, about 90 knots or so. And then looking now down at about 9,000 feet, generally light winds for the most part over the Gulf there. And then as we get out to the west, you can see the reflection of that low, which has been sitting there for the last day or so, and about 20 knots. And on the backside, northerly winds about 35 knots. And then moving now bound to about 3,000 feet, you can still see the reflection of the low with some easterly winds, the northeasterly winds, 40 knots across the Bering Sea. Really not a whole lot of wind as you get over into the Gulf. And now looking at our turbulent conditions. For some reason, the turbulent chart I saved is not the one, but we'll kind of work around it here. Generally look for some moderate turbulence, basically along the Alaska Peninsula and along the Aleutians there. We'll see some spotty and marginal moderate turbulence along the eastern Kenai Peninsula and through some of those gaps along the Alaska Range there. Well, that's all for this portion of the show. We'll see you next with the Marines.
Any sound in a normally quiet area will seem louder than it would in a noisy environment. Now, given what we know about how noise is generated by airplanes and how it's perceived by people on the ground, we can make one simple observation. If we're flying an airplane with a constant speed prop, reducing RPM is the single most effective thing we can do to reduce noise. And if we're flying a fixed pitch prop, greater altitude and lateral separation is our most effective tactic. With that understanding, let's look at strategies for reducing noise in the airport environment. And let's begin with the takeoff. Some airports seem to attract residential development the way mobile homes attract tornadoes. It's important to select a run-up location as far from houses as possible. For the same reason, if you have a choice, use a runway located as far from noise-sensitive neighborhoods as possible. Even if it weren't a good idea, for safety reasons, avoiding intersection takeoffs helps us reduce our noise signature. Using the full length of a runway allows us to gain the maximum amount of altitude before we cross the airport boundary and fly over nearby homes. Using the best angle of climb speed will net us the greatest altitude gain for the distance traveled. If this makes you uncomfortable, stick with the best rate of climb speed for your climb out. We'll retract our landing gear as soon as we have established a positive rate of climb and can no longer land on the remaining runway. That reduces drag, which again allows us to leave the airport environment with the greatest altitude gain. As we approach the airport boundary, and certainly before we fly over any residential areas, we'll reduce power to the cruise climb power setting. This will slow the prop as much as safely possible. Your pilot's operating handbook or airplane flight manual will provide you with acceptable cruise climb power settings. You may be surprised at how slowly you can safely turn that propeller. Many pilots don't realize that operating over square, that is, at a higher manifold pressure than prop RPM, is perfectly permissible in most airplanes. And remember also to make your power reduction as smoothly as possible to reduce those abrupt, attention-getting sounds. Let's apply these suggestions to an average A36 Bonanza and see the difference in noise created at the departure end of the runway. First, a typical high-power, low-rate of climb departure. Now let's compare that to a best rate of climb departure with a power reduction to the cruise climb setting. As you can see, this simple change in procedure yielded a 5 dB reduction in noise at the airport boundary. The route we choose for our departure is very important. Our first choice would be any noise abatement procedure established for the runway we're using. Where none are published, I often ask the FBO or airport management about the best departure plan. At controlled airports, ATC instructions override noise abatement procedures. But I've usually found that traffic and weather permitting, controllers will allow me to use departure routes that help me avoid noise-sensitive neighborhoods. If no noise abatement procedures have been established, we'll rely on common sense to choose a departure path. We'll try to climb out over industrial areas or interstate highways where will be the quietest activity around. Airports hemmed in by development pose a special challenge. Sometimes the best you can do is just head for the least populated areas, at the highest possible altitude, of course. Flight instructors are particularly important in the effort to reduce perceived aircraft noise. Repetitive activities like touch and goes and practice instrument approaches are best performed at rural airports wherever possible. Simulated engine failure should not be done in areas where the roar of the engine coming back to life will be particularly annoying to people on the ground. Ground reference maneuvers such as Turns around a point should be practiced in the least densely populated areas available to you. Arriving at our destination, it's again important for us to know and use any established noise abatement procedure. Beyond that, remember the basic guidelines. Stay as high as possible, keep the prop as slow as possible, and fly patterns as close to the runway as possible. Some pilots fly an unnecessarily wide, long pattern. This not only takes them out over residential areas at relatively low altitude, it doesn't leave many options in the event of a power loss. Whenever possible, maintain pattern altitude until turning onto the base leg. This is particularly beneficial from the noise standpoint when you have to extend the downwind leg for any reason. Some pilots also allow themselves to get too low, too far out. Then they have to drag the airplane up to the runway with power. The folks living underneath this experiment in pitch and power probably won't appreciate the demonstration. Remember that flaps are used to slow down and go down. It just doesn't make sense to get any draggier than necessary in the pattern and then have to add power to reach the runway. Clean, stable, low power, low drag approaches are significantly quieter approaches. On final, stay at or above the VASI and don't advance the propeller control until you've made your final power reduction.
Welcome back. Let's take a look at the marine forecast for southeast Alaska. Well, for inside waters, look for southerly or northerly winds, 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Central waters are near Frederick Sound there. North to northeast winds, 15 knots, 3-foot seas. Lincoln Island, Glacier Bay, northerly winds, 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Eastern Gulf, there we'll look for westerly winds, 15 knots with 10-foot seas. We'll see some 15 knot winds out of the northwest or 15 knots, 15 to 25 knots along the coastal areas there with seas right around 9 to 10 feet or so. And moving in towards Tuesday's forecast, we'll see the southern outside waters look for westerly winds 20 knots with 7-foot seas. Just north of there, look for northwesterly winds 20 knots with 6-foot seas, northwesterly winds 15 knots. And the eastern Gulf, easterly winds, westerly winds 10 knots with 5-foot seas. Lincoln Island, Glacier Bay with that high pressure building into the interior now will have northerly winds about 30 knots with 6-foot seas. Northerly winds in the central sections hold about 10 knots, 2-foot seas, and northwesterly winds 15 knots with 3-foot seas in the southern inside waters. Now for Monday's forecast for South Central, we're basically looking over into the to the western Gulf there. Look for northwesterly or northeasterly winds 15 knots with 7-foot seas, 20 knots out of the northeast, 6-foot seas over in the waters just east of Cape Suckling to Gore Point there. And generally look for the southeast of the Barren Islands, northeasterly winds 15 knots with 6-foot seas. Waters near Kodiak, northeasterly winds 15 knots with 6-foot seas. Shallow Strait, northeasterly winds 30 knots with 16-foot seas. And the waters west of the Barren Islands, as well as southern Cook Inlet, look for northeasterly winds 30 knots with seas 11 to 13 feet. And the waters just north of Cape Beatty there, look for northerly winds at 15 knots with 5-foot seas. And now as we move in towards Tuesday's forecast, generally the directions are pretty much going to stay about the same. 20 knots now over Cape Suckling to Cape Clear there, and 7-foot seas. We'll look for Cape Clear to Gore Point. Northeasterly winds 25 knots pretty much over southeast of the Barren Islands, 35 knots with 17-foot seas in the Shallow Strait area. And then 30s pretty much for the west of the Barrens, as well as the southern portion of Cook Inlet. And again, be freezing spray to heavy freezing spray in some of these areas. Now for the Alaska Peninsula for tomorrow, we'll be looking for the eastern end, southeasterly winds 25 knots with 11-foot seas. Western end, look for southerly winds 25 knots with 10-foot seas. As you get north of the Alaska Peninsula, look for northeasterly winds 20 knots with 10-foot seas. And in the east and in the Bristol Bay area, look for northeasterly winds 25 knots with 6-foot seas. Now for Tuesday's forecast, Bristol Bay, Northeasterly winds 35 knots, 6-foot seas. Easterly winds for the most part north of the Alaska Peninsula 20 knots. South of the Alaska Peninsula 25 to 30 knots with 10 to 11-foot seas. And now for the Aleutians there. In the eastern portion of the Aleutians, look for basically south to southeast winds, 15 to 20 knots. The seas anywhere from 10 to 13 feet. Over the near AKwx or so, look for northeasterly winds 30 to 35 knots with seas 14 to 18-foot seas, and northerly winds for the western and central sections 30 to 35 knots with 18-foot seas in the central sections there. For Tuesday's forecast, northerly winds continuing out to the west there, 40 knots over the central sections, 30 to 35 knots in the eastern sections, and over towards Unalaska, northeasterly winds 30 knots with seas 11 feet. Now for the eastern portion of the Bering Sea, generally look for the Pribilofs to be northerly gales, 15-foot seas, and we'll be looking for northeasterly winds in most areas, anywhere from 30 to 35 knots, except as you get up towards St. Lawrence Island, or I should say over towards Gamble there, look for northeasterly winds 20 knots, and it's pretty much ice covered there. And Tuesday's forecast, we'll be looking for St. Lawrence Island, northeasterly winds 25 knots with it's ice covered there. And then you see the southern areas here, anywhere from about 25 to 30 knots with some heavy freezing spray in those areas. And as we get further up north there, for the most part, Wales, Cape Thompson, look for northerly winds 10 knots. And you see those westerly winds 20 to 25 knots as you get along the Beaufort Sea coast there. And for Tuesday's forecast, pretty much about the same, just a little bit stronger as you get over along the Beaufort Sea coast. Quick wrap up around the state. Generally, we've got the winter storm warnings with some blizzard warnings up along the Arctic coast and also the northeastern portion of the Brooks Range there. We see a low pressure center which is kind of moving up from the south there, rain and snow along the Aleutians. We'll just kind of flip through these because we're running out of time here. A little snow and blowing snow moving into the Bristol Bay area. And finally on Tuesday, we'll see clear skies for the most part over the interior. That's all for tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.